The air in the marriage office was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, sweat, and the particular cruelty of bored men. Wyatt stood motionless, a granite island in a sea of smirking faces, his huge hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had come down from the mountain for salt, flour, and a new axe head, a simple trip that had soured the moment he stepped into the town of redemption. Now he was trapped, caught in the legal snare laid by Jedediah Sterling, a man whose wealth was matched only by his malice. Beside him, a young Chinese woman trembled, her slight frame lost in a light blue prairie dress that seemed to mock the harsh reality of her situation. She stared at the floorboards, her face a pale, frozen mask of terror. Sheriff Vance, a man whose spine was as flexible as his morals, droned on, reading the marriage certificate with a performative solemnity that made Wyatt's stomach turn. "By the power vested in me by the territory," Vance declared, his eyes flicking toward Sterling for approval, "I pronounce you man and wife." A wave of coarse laughter filled the small room. This was the punchline. Sterling had arranged her passage with the promise of work, only to use her as a pawn in a game of public humiliation aimed at the quiet mountain man who refused to sell him timber rights. Wyatt felt a hot surge of rage, but it was quickly cooled by the sight of the woman's shaking hands. Her name, they had told him, was a mockery whispered among the crowd, but he refused to hear it from their lips. He met Sterling's smug gaze across the room, a silent promise passing between them that had nothing to do with vows. When Vance shoved a pen into his hand, Wyatt signed his name with a heavy, deliberate stroke. Then, ignoring the jeers, he turned to the woman. "Come," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise. It was the first word he had spoken. She flinched, but when she finally looked up, her dark eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, the shared humiliation forged a fragile, unspoken alliance in the suffocating heat of the office. The journey up the mountain was a study in silence. Wyatt led the way, his long strides eating up the dusty trail while she followed a few paces behind, her city-worn shoes struggling against the rocks and roots. The boisterous cruelty of the town faded with every upward foot, replaced by the immense, indifferent quiet of the pines and the vast, empty sky. He never looked back, not because he didn't care, but because he could feel her presence as a tangible weight, a new and complex responsibility he had not asked for. He could hear the soft scuff of her steps, the occasional sharp intake of breath as she navigated a difficult patch of ground. He was acutely aware of her fear, a scent as real as the pine needles under his boots. When they finally reached his cabin, nestled in a high meadow overlooking the valley, the sun was beginning to dip below the western peaks, painting the horizon in strokes of orange and bruised purple. The cabin was small, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, with a single stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke from the banked morning fire. It was a place of solitude, not loneliness, a distinction he feared she would not understand. He pushed the heavy door open and stood aside, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated on the threshold, her eyes darting around the Spartan interior, a single bed, a rough table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and shelves neatly stacked with provisions. It was a man's world, stark and functional. Wyatt watched her take it all in, her posture rigid with apprehension. He broke the silence, his voice gentle. "You are safe here." He did not know if she understood the words, but he hoped she understood the tone. That night, he laid a fresh blanket on the floor near the hearth for himself and pointed her toward the bed. He turned his back as she climbed into it, granting her a privacy that was the only form of dignity he could offer in this charade of a marriage. The mountain held its breath around them, 2 strangers bound by a hateful piece of paper, their futures as uncertain as the coming dawn. Days bled into a week, then 2, each one governed by a silent, unspoken routine. Wyatt rose before the sun, tending to his chores with a quiet efficiency that was second nature. He never intruded on her space, giving the small cabin over to her during the day while he worked outside. He had a project, one that consumed his energy and focused his mind, a bulwark against the lingering anger from the town below. He was digging a channel, lining it with carefully selected stones, diverting a trickle of water from a high spring down toward a fallow patch of earth near the cabin. It was slow, back-breaking work, moving earth and rock under the relentless summer sun. He worked without pause, his powerful muscles moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. From the cabin's single window, she watched him. At first, her observation was fearful, a constant monitoring of the large, quiet man who was now her husband. She saw the raw power in his shoulders as he levered a boulder into place, but she also saw the strange gentleness in his hands as he adjusted a smaller stone to ensure a perfect fit. He was not the brute the men in town had treated him as. He was deliberate, patient, and utterly self-contained. He left food for her on the table each morning, a portion of oatmeal, a piece of bread, and never demanded a word or a glance. One afternoon he found a cluster of wild columbines growing near the spring and placed a single, perfect blossom in a tin cup on the table. When he returned at dusk, he saw she had added water to the cup. It was their first collaboration, a silent acknowledgement that they were sharing this space, not just occupying it. A few days later, as he sat cleaning dirt from under his fingernails, she approached him for the first time, holding out a bowl of warm broth. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but her eyes were steady. "Thank you," she whispered, the two words fragile in the vast mountain quiet. Wyatt simply nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The channel was for her, he realized. It was a promise of something that could grow here. The fragile peace of their mountain sanctuary was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Wyatt straightened from his work on the channel, his hand instinctively going to the axe handle resting against a nearby pine. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, led by Jedediah Sterling, his face set in a condescending smirk. Sheriff Vance and another of Sterling's hired men flanked him, their presence an ugly stain on the pristine meadow. They reined in their horses a few yards from Wyatt, their casual arrogance a stark contrast to the mountain's solemnity. "Well, well," Sterling called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Just checking on the happy couple. Making sure you're treating your property right, Wyatt." His eyes slid past Wyatt to the cabin door where she had appeared, her face pale. She quickly retreated back into the shadows, but not before Sterling had gotten his look. "She's a shy one, isn't she? You ought to teach her some manners. Teach her to greet her benefactor." Wyatt didn't move. He stood between the riders and his home, his sheer size a silent declaration. His knuckles were white on the axe handle, but his face was a mask of calm. "You've got no business here, Sterling," he said, his voice low and even, yet carrying a weight that made the horses shift uneasily. Vance, ever the sycophant, spoke up. "Now, Wyatt, Mr. Sterling is just being a concerned citizen. The law says he has an interest in her welfare." The lie was so blatant it was almost comical. Wyatt's gaze remained fixed on Sterling. He knew this was a test, a provocation designed to bait him into violence, which would give Vance the excuse he needed. He would not give them the satisfaction. "Her welfare is my concern now," Wyatt stated, the words simple but absolute. "You've seen what you came to see. Now leave." For a long moment Sterling stared him down, searching for a crack in his composure. Finding none, he let out a frustrated sigh and pulled on his reins. "Have it your way, mountain man, but don't forget who owns this valley. Everything in it, and everyone, eventually answers to me." They turned their horses and rode away, their mocking laughter echoing briefly before being swallowed by the pines, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more menacing than before. The visit from Sterling was a catalyst, burning away the last vestiges of fear and uncertainty that had defined their cohabitation. The threat was no longer an abstract memory from the town below. It had followed them home, and it had a face. That evening the silence in the cabin was different. It was not the silence of strangers, but the quiet of allies contemplating a shared enemy. As Wyatt mended a leather strap by the firelight, she emerged from the corner where she usually sat and came to the table. She laid out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle containing a set of fine needles and thread, items she must have hidden away. Then, with purpose in her eyes, she pointed out the window toward his ongoing project. Using a series of determined gestures, she conveyed a question, an offer. She wanted to help. The next morning she joined him by the half-finished channel. He expected her to be a hindrance, her small frame unsuited to the heavy labor. He was wrong. She possessed a meticulous eye and a surprising dexterity. While he moved the larger rocks, she followed behind, chinking the gaps with smaller stones and packing soil with a precision that made the channel stronger and more efficient. She worked without complaint, her brow furrowed in concentration, her light blue dress soon smudged with the rich mountain earth. They fell into a new rhythm, a partnership of brute strength and careful detail. He would loosen a section of earth with his shovel, and she would be there to clear the debris, her movements quick and economical. They began to speak, haltingly at first. He learned her name was Ilara. It meant light, a fact that felt profoundly true. She learned his was Wyatt. He taught her the English words for stone, water, sun. She, in turn, showed him how the roots of certain plants could be used to reinforce the channel's banks. The project was no longer his gift to her. It was their shared creation, a testament to their unified stand against the world that had tried to break them. Each stone they placed together was an act of defiance, a quiet declaration that they would not be defined by the cruelty that had bound them. They were building more than an irrigation ditch. They were building a foundation. With the first trickle of clear, cold water flowing down the stone-lined channel, a new chapter began. The water, a silver ribbon snaking through the meadow, was a symbol of their success. Together they tilled the fallow earth, their hands, large and small, working in concert to break up the soil. The plot of land, once barren, was now dark and rich with promise. They planted seeds Wyatt had bought on his last trip to town, beans, squash, corn, and a few hardy herbs Ilara recognized from her homeland. The garden became the new center of their world, a place of shared labor and quiet hope. In the evenings, as the sun set and the mountain air grew cool, they would sit by the hearth and talk. Their conversations were a patchwork of broken English, gestures, and drawings sketched in the ash on the hearthstone. He learned the full story of her journey, the lies she had been told about a respectable job as a seamstress in a wealthy household, the betrayal she felt upon arrival. Hearing it from her, the injustice burned in him hotter than ever before. He told her of his life, of his parents who had loved these mountains, of his choice to live apart from the greed and pettiness of towns like Redemption. He spoke of his respect for the land, for the way it provided for those who understood its rhythms. He needed to understand the legal ground they stood on, however shaky. Leaving Ilara with enough food and a solemn promise to return quickly, he made the long journey back down to Redemption. He bypassed the saloon and the sheriff's office, heading straight for the one place of quiet integrity in the town, Arthur's Mercantile. Arthur was an old man with kind eyes and a deep-seated weariness of the town's corrupt power structure. He had watched Wyatt grow up and had always treated him with a quiet respect. Wyatt laid out the situation plainly, his voice low amidst the smells of canvas, coffee, and cured leather. "I want to know if the marriage can be undone," Wyatt concluded. "Annulled. She never agreed to it." Arthur polished a pair of spectacles with a slow, deliberate motion, his expression grave. "Wyatt, you know how this town works," he said softly. "The judge is Sterling's cousin. The law is whatever Sterling says it is on any given day. To get an annulment, you'd need to prove coercion, and the only witnesses are the very men who'd lie to protect him. Sheriff Vance would testify you entered into the contract willingly." He paused, letting the harsh truth settle. "Worse, if you did manage to dissolve it, what would become of her? She has no status, no protection. Sterling would claim she was his indentured property. He'd have her working in the saloon before nightfall." The words landed like stones in Wyatt's gut. They were trapped. The law, which should have been their shield, was the very cage that held them. He had thought to free her, but the system was designed to ensure there was no escape. A cold resolve settled over him. If they could not break the bond, they would have to fortify it. He began to gather supplies, not just the necessities, but items of purpose. He bought bags of seeds for a fall planting, a sturdy shovel, and, after a moment's thought, a bolt of dark green wool fabric. He brought the fabric to the counter. "What's her favorite color?" Arthur asked gently. Wyatt paused, realizing he had never asked. He only knew the pale blue of the dress she had been forced into. "Something strong," Wyatt said finally. "Something that will last." The confrontation came sooner than he expected. It wasn't with fists or guns, but with a folded piece of paper delivered by Sheriff Vance, who rode up to the homestead looking deeply uncomfortable. Ilara stood beside Wyatt on the porch, no longer retreating into the shadows. Her presence was a quiet statement of unity. Vance refused to meet Wyatt's eyes, focusing instead on a spot on the cabin wall. "Official notice from Mr. Sterling," he mumbled, handing the document to Wyatt. "He's filing a formal claim on the water rights to the spring feeding your project." He gestured vaguely at the flourishing garden and the irrigation channel that was its lifeblood. "Says it's on his surveyed property line. He's ordering you to cease and desist, to dismantle the channel." The legal jargon was a thin veil for the raw threat beneath. Sterling intended to starve them out, to destroy the life they had painstakingly built stone by stone, seed by seed. He was reclaiming his power by attacking the very symbol of their resilience. Wyatt's hand tightened on the paper, his knuckles turning white. It was a declaration of war, waged not against him alone, but against both of them, against the future they had dared to imagine. After Vance had scurried away, Wyatt explained the document to Ilara. She listened without a word, her gaze fixed on the vibrant green rose of their garden, a splash of defiant life against the vast, untamed wilderness. He expected to see fear in her eyes, the same terror he had seen in the marriage office. Instead, he saw a hard, determined glint he was coming to recognize. She looked from the garden back to him, her expression resolute. She would not be broken. They were looking for evidence of the original survey, the one conducted before Sterling had bought up the valley and redrawn the lines to his own benefit. Days were spent traversing ridges and valleys, their shared purpose a silent bond between them. In the evenings they would visit Arthur in town, poring over dusty territorial records and archived deeds in the back room of his mercantile. Arthur, emboldened by their quiet determination, became their co-conspirator, helping them navigate the complex and often contradictory documents. It was Alara who found it. Tucked inside an old ledger was a reference to a territorial water treaty, an agreement made with the native tribes who had lived in the valley generations before. The treaty, long forgotten and ignored by men like Sterling, specifically designated certain springs as common-use resources, untouchable by private land claims, to ensure the land could sustain life. The spring feeding their garden was marked on the accompanying map with a distinctive symbol. It was their answer. It was a law older and more fundamental than any deed Sterling could forge. Wyatt called for a town meeting. He stood before the assembled populace in the town hall, the same men who had laughed at his humiliation now sitting in judgment. Sterling was there, flanked by Vance, his expression one of supreme confidence. He saw this as the final act of his cruel play. But when Wyatt spoke, his voice was not that of a cornered animal. It was calm, steady, and filled with the authority of truth. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, his father's map, the old survey markers, and finally the territorial treaty. He unrolled the brittle map for all to see. "This spring is not his to claim," Wyatt declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "It belongs to the land. It belongs to anyone who needs it to survive." Then he stepped aside, and Alara stepped forward. She did not speak. She simply stood there, her gaze sweeping across the silent crowd. In her quiet dignity, they saw not a victim, but a survivor. They saw the living embodiment of the injustice they had all passively witnessed, and a profound sense of shame began to ripple through the room. The weight of the evidence, combined with Alara's powerful, silent testimony, was overwhelming. The old treaty was a foundational document of the territory, and to ignore it would be to undermine the legitimacy of every land claim in the valley, including Sterling's own. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a tide of public opinion slowly turning against the man who had held them all in his grip for so long. Men who had once laughed at Wyatt now nodded in grim agreement. They were homesteaders and ranchers. They understood the sanctity of a water source. Sterling saw the shift, his face contorting in a mask of disbelief and rage. For the first time, his money and influence were not enough. He had been defeated, not by force, but by a truth he had long ago forgotten. He stormed out of the hall, his power irrevocably fractured. The forced marriage, intended as Sterling's cruelest joke, had become his undoing. It had created an alliance he could never have predicted, a partnership that had unearthed the history he had tried to bury. Wyatt and Alara walked out of the town hall and into the late afternoon sun, leaving the town to reckon with its own conscience. They returned to their mountain home not as a man and a woman bound by a legal document, but as partners who had faced down a tyrant and won. Their home was no longer a refuge from the world, but a fortress they had successfully defended. The irrigation channel, glinting in the sunlight, was more than just a clever bit of engineering. It was a monument to their shared resilience, a testament to the idea that a life could be built, stone by stone, on a foundation of mutual respect and quiet courage. In the years that followed, the garden flourished, expanding with each season. Their story became a quiet legend in the valley, a moral touchstone that subtly reshaped the community. Travelers would sometimes seek out the homestead, hoping to see the famous project, but they would find no grand structure. They would only see a simple, sturdy cabin, a vibrant, sprawling garden, and a man and a woman working side by side, their movements synchronized in the easy rhythm of a shared life. What Wyatt had built for her, and what she had built with him, was not made of stone or wood. It was a future, a history, and a legacy of quiet dignity that nourished the entire valley.